record of this event, and then we can also share it with the other participants, other interest persons. So welcome everyone. So sorry for the slight delay due to the as usual complex management of conference, with them hybrid in presence or just virtual. Every time we will be late sometimes. So that has been the case also today. Sorry for that. So it's my great pleasure to introduce and moderate this afternoon panel, which is focusing on a practitioner perspective on international disaster law. So the idea was really to engage with a discussion with legal and policy officer of different entities, different international organizations or state or other entities which play a role in the management and prevention of disaster, and to discuss with them what is the role of law with regard to their activities. Does law play any positive role? Is law a hurdle for fulfilling their mandate? Is it a supportive element? So the idea will be to have a couple of basic questions around it in a very informal discussion. So starting from the very first question would be, so how does law support or create troubles to the activities of your organization? Could you provide some insight of what is the role, international, also domestic, the law with regard to the prevention and management of disaster? What is the experience of your institution? The first speaker will be Isabelle Granger. We already had Frank with us, basically the head of the policy department at the Federation, which was already mentioned in the disaster law program, which is headed by Isabelle. So without further ado, please, Isabelle, you can start with this first very broad question, then we continue with the roundtable with the other speaker.
Thank you, Giulio. It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks for the kind invite. I wish I could be with you in Rome, but unfortunately I couldn't travel today. So just to give you maybe a bit of history as to why IFRC started to investigate the area of international disaster law back in 2001. It was essentially to address the problems we faced as an international organization, but also as an IFRC network of Red Cross and Red Crescent societies worldwide in international disaster relief. So like any other actors, we also face problems in terms of custom clearance of international relief goods that we were trying to import in disaster in countries affected by disasters. We also face problems such as the lack of recognition of professional qualifications, as an example, for medical doctors. Many times we had to send our international delegates on tourist visa to countries affected by disaster because visas for international relief for this specific situation were simply not existent, not available in the country. We also find that there were often lack of understanding of the general rules of the road for international disaster relief, or simply that these rules were not existing. As an example, which entity in the government is responsible for international appeal, for issuing the appeal, but also for receiving the offers from international actors. Problems such as who's the focal point for the coordination of international relief? What are the coordination mechanisms between sectoral agencies who are also responsible for facilitating the entry of international relief? These mechanisms were often non-existent or very unclear. So in short, our operations were conducted in many cases in a complete legal vacuum, in the absence of legal provision that would define the rules of the role. And ultimately, all these aspects were creating significant delays for IFRC network in our international response to disasters. And also, of course, these delays were creating as well significant problems for people affected by these disasters. It meant that they were not receiving the help they were very much needed that could be life-saving for them. As a personal experience, I was deployed in 2005 to Indonesia to support IFRC understand the legal framework applicable to international disaster relief. and define our rights and obligation in the country. What is important to understand is that in Indonesia, just like in many other countries, IFRC has privilege and immunities similar to those of the United Nations or to states. But often these mechanisms are not implemented in practice, and there's a lack of clarity in regard to the protocols and mechanisms that are applicable to IFRC in such situation, and it is the same situation to other international actors as well. So in short, these legal issues have been faced not only by Red Cross and Red Crescent actors, but by all humanitarian actors providing international relief. And even though significant progress has been made globally to legally prepare legal framework for the management of international relief, of course, a lot remains to be done as we continue to face these issues in disaster operations. And to give another more recent example, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has reminded us again of the importance of being legally prepared to face disasters, crises, and emergencies. Indeed, legal and policy instruments have underpinned all aspects of the COVID-19 response, from unprecedented restriction on freedom of movement and assembly, expert restriction of protective personal equipment, or even expedited approval of vaccines and other therapeutics. So of course, many legal issues that were not necessarily, for which the states were not necessarily prepared for before the pandemic. Of course, they have adopted a significant number of emergency decrees in order to manage the crisis because of the legal vacuum existent in their country. So of course, they had to rapidly provide for these provisions that were very necessary for the management of the crisis. One example that our membership has faced in this COVID-19 is in regard to the restrictions that have been introduced to curb the spread of the COVID-19. So it has prevented many of our own national societies, such as other humanitarian actors and their staff and volunteers, from performing their critical auxiliary role and fulfill their humanitarian mandate as first responders to disaster and emergencies, and in providing community-based health and social care to vulnerable populations. As explained by my colleague Rachel earlier today, states should provide legal facilities to all qualified humanitarian actors to support the delivery of life-saving relief to people in need. So what it means for us concretely, what it meant for us concretely is that, just to provide one example, in some countries we could not even have access to our own warehouses where we had prepositioned relief goods and stock for the support of the most vulnerable affected by crisis and disasters. Because of the restriction imposed on the movement of people, we could not circulate freely. I mean, our national societies, their staff and volunteers could not circulate freely. And ultimately, it means that we had some problem in the logistic pipeline. You know, if we cannot even access our own warehouse to be able to send those goods to disaster-affected countries or to even provide for the needs of the COVID-19, then of course it means significant problems for us. So based on this, of course, IFRC has been a strong contributor to the development of international disaster law and has produced numerous guidance tools to support law and policymakers to strengthen their domestic legal frameworks for effective disaster risk governance. Two recent tools produced by IFRC Disaster Law, which have both made a meaningful contribution to international disaster law, are the recent guidance on law and public health emergency preparedness and response, and the checklist on disaster preparedness and response, which advise states on methods to ensure that they have effective legal arrangements in place related to disaster and health emergency risk management. So these tools address topics such as how the law should provide for the roles and responsibilities of all actors involved in all phases of disaster risk management, from disaster risk reduction, preparedness, response, and recovery. Together, they also encompass all types of hazards, including public health emergencies and other types of disaster caused by increasing climate risk. They provide for coordination mechanism that should be put in place between different governmental actors and sectoral agencies. They promote the protection and inclusion of vulnerable groups and communities in disaster risk management. And they suggest critical legal facilities that should be provided to humanitarian actors to expedite the delivery of life-saving assistance to people in need. So I wanted to maybe end my remarks on this first segment to discuss some of the mechanism we use at IFRC. First, the mechanism of the International Conference of the Red Cross and Red Crescent. So we use this mechanism in order for these recommendations that we develop to be adopted by the state parties to the Geneva Convention. And through resolution of the International Conference, they become international norms and recognized standards. It is also through resolution of the International Conference that states have provided the mandate to the IFRC and National Red Cross and Red Crescent societies to support them as auxiliary to their government in the humanitarian field in providing technical legal advice to strengthen disaster risk governance through laws and policies, and in implementing the recommendations developed by IFRC network in domestic legal context. On this last point of implementation, I will reserve my remarks for the second question and the second segment of this panel. But I'll also want to discuss another mechanism that we use at IFRC or to, in the Red Cross and Red Crescent network in an emergency. We use what we call quiet diplomacy. So essentially, we reach to authorities to request legal facilities for our national societies in order for them to be able to operate and conduct their activities. So essentially, there are two lines of requests that for which we approach authorities. The first line of request is in regard to the needs of our own membership, so the legal framework that should be put in place to allow our national society to operate and fulfill their humanitarian mandate in an emergency. Since they are auxiliary to their authorities in the humanitarian field, by virtue of their unique legal personality, they need a special treatment. They should be provided a special treatment by authorities with dedicated legal facilities in order for them to conduct their operation. Likewise, we also have an interest in order to make sure that the entire system works for international disaster relief or for comprehensive disaster risk management. So we also advocate to authorities in order for them to put legal mechanism and the legal framework in place for the entire system to work. So, of course, the general work of IFRC in the area of disaster law is to support authorities, strengthen their legal framework to ensure effective disaster risk governance. So just to say that basically we have, we support authorities in normal time, but also we have very special requests during an emergency where we also work, we advocate to authorities to make sure that these legal facilities are provided to all actors in the system. And ultimately, of course, this is to fulfill our humanitarian mandate, meaning that the needs of the most vulnerable affected by disaster are answered. So I will stop here for the first segment. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabella. So let's move now, being also this conference organizing Rome, let's move to Rome, to War4 program, which, as you know, is one of the leader actors in providing humanitarian relief. It's my pleasure to have with us John Graham, who works in the legal office. Now today is out of Rome, so he could join us just virtually. Also, in your case, John, if you may elaborate on how does law act or plays a role with regard to the activities of War4 program.
Thank you, Professor Bartolini. It's a pleasure to be here on behalf of the World Food Programme. I'm a senior legal officer at WFP, and my work focuses on issues related to privileges and immunities, governance, and donor agreements. So in many respects, kind of relevant to the area we're focusing on now, the maybe the more operational aspects of WFP's work. As you mentioned, I'm away from Rome today, so unfortunately can't participate in person, but it's an honor and a pleasure to be here. And on behalf of WFP and the legal office, just like to thank you again, Professor Bartolini, for inviting me to speak. Maybe to start, I'd just like to kind of maybe just give a quick overview of WFP. So the World Food Programme is basically a subsidiary program of the United Nations and the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. So we're the only UN entity that's got the parentage of both the United Nations Secretariat and a specialized agency in the form of FAO. So as a result of WFP's UN status, it enjoys certain privileges and immunities, and these are intended to ensure that we can operate in an independent manner. They're vital for our operations. They allow us the flexibility and freedom, or they should at least, when they're fully respected, to kind of operate in a swift, nimble manner that can respond quickly to emergencies. And WFP's mandate really is, well, it has a dual humanitarian and development mandate, but the bulk of its work, the great bulk of its work, is focused on emergency response. So we're constantly dealing with disasters. From our perspective, it's not really, or at least my perspective, it's not really the natural disasters that have generated legal issues. Rather, it's more the man-made ones, and that's because, you know, WFP is a humanitarian actor, so it's aiming to provide assistance to those who need it, regardless of any political affiliations, race, gender, and without an external interference. And in a conflict that can be prove challenging, you know, our aim is really to this aim that we have is really challenged in the conflict situation, whether it be by host governments or de facto authorities, you know, who can try and influence our operational independence and the extent to which our privileges and immunities are respected. These are kind of long-standing issues, and I think you know, well understood, well publicized. The situation in Tigray is currently is you know, a real case in point. You know, and you know, there, you know, I suppose you would say that, you know, it's, you know, the, without wanting to kind of stray into political issues, I mean, I think it's fair to say that some of the operational independence of WFP maybe is being challenged, or not so much WFP, but other UN entities, OCHA, I think in particular, is being challenged by the situation there. And, you know, we have faced tremendous difficulty in accessing beneficiaries, which, you know, is the whole purpose of WFP. So it's a huge problem there. But I imagine that these issues are kind of been well spoken to in the past. You're probably familiar with, and I thought maybe it would be good to speak about an area that's maybe coming from the fringes of our work into the center of it on a daily basis, and which is kind of creating legal obligations for us, or legal hurdles that you know, we're finding maybe challenging to navigate, and which are you know, delaying or complicating, I would say, or potentially can complicate our responses to disasters and the provision of assistance to beneficiaries. And that's kind of donor conditionality. You know, maybe this affects WFP more than most entities because WFP is voluntarily funded. So we're completely reliant on contributions to support our programs. They can come from private or public sources. Unlike other UN entities, we don't have any mandatory contributions from our member states. So, you know, it really is what can be generated in terms of fundraising that we can then pass on as assistance to our beneficiaries. You know, to give you an idea of the scale of the operations, WFP operates in around 90 countries and feeds around 100 million people a year. But our operational needs fall short of what we receive. So, you know, if you look at the next budget, which will be approved in November, we expect to need $13 billion next year to implement our program of work, but we actually expect to receive approximately 8.5. So there's a big shortfall there. And, you know, when it comes to donor conditionality, this shortfall places us in reality in a difficult position because, you know, obviously we need the funds, we don't have the funds, and we need to work with donors to you know, receive the funding to implement the programs and provide assistance to our beneficiaries. This conditionality, it's very broad. It touches off all sorts of areas. I mean, the key area, I suppose, the most sensitive or well-known one is probably in terms of the application of donor sanctions lists or requests to apply donor sanctions lists. Then, you know, but there's also, you know, certain aspects of national laws that donors want to see reflected in their contribution agreements. And also a desire for maybe WFP to take certain policy positions which maybe have not yet been taken by its executive board, which is its you know, first level governing body. You know, the requests we find are becoming more frequent. They're more demanding in terms of, you know, reporting obligations, oversight, spending restrictions, and you know, the areas they encompass really are growing. You know, it's everything from environmental standards to which certain entities we can or can't work with. You know, basically what one could say if one were to look at it kind of remotely would be, or the kind of, I suppose, the macro level would be that our grant agreements are turning into much more onerous quid pro quo commercial type agreements, and that obviously poses a problem. And you know, it poses a problem on many different areas. First of all, it potentially endangers our operational independence and conflicts with the principles that underpin our status. You know, so that's our privileges and immunities and the humanitarian principles. It also undermines the governing authority of WFP's governing bodies because, in a sense, it's a side door into the operations of the program. You know, the policy should be approved by its member states, and we should follow them. That's how it should work. But you know, sometimes donors try to insist on certain positions for the program to take, which then, you know, basically one could take the view that they're almost replacing the authority of the executive board. I mean, that's just one view. It's obviously we don't accept that when it happens. It's you know, that the governing body's authorities are kind of sacrosanct, if you will, which should be the case, of course, for a UN entity. These restrictions, though, they can potentially restrict our ability to engage with implementing partners, and they can create expensive compliance consequences. So, you know, in terms of trying to make sure that if a commitment is made to a donor, it needs to be honored. And, you know, that can result in a lot of additional work in terms of providing guidance to the field and in terms of how to actually you know, adhere to the agreement terms, through to, you know, new agreement templates, passing on of special conditions to cooperating partners, etc. And of course, a great deal of time is also spent in the actual negotiation of the agreement, which can take, you know, a long time in certain cases. You know, from a kind of reputational basis, you know, WFP is neutral, but, you know, the more donor conditionality that's present, you know, the greater the risk of a perception that WFP is acting kind of as a policy tool for donor governments. And obviously that has, you know, serious implications in terms of how we are perceived on the ground politically, and also for the safety and security of WFP staff. You know,
John,
also,
can you
yep.
wrap up in order to also give the floor to the other?
Yeah, sorry, excuse me. I didn't realize I was sorry if I'm going on too long. So there are some other you know, issues posed with conditionality, and you know, while we have been pushing back, you know, the trend is toward greater conditionality, not less. I think maybe we can speak to the, you know, the solutions and that in the second part of the discussion, but just to say that, you know, this is an area which, you know, is posing, you know, significant legal issues for the program, and I think the wider UN in terms of being able to respond nimbly and quickly when disasters occur. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we move to the regional level. We spoke about the universal actors, but then let's move to the regional level. Of course, one of the major players is the European Commission with DG ECHO, which is one of the also main donor and also main proactive actor in this area. We have the pleasure to have with us Francesco Pontiroli Gobe, who is legal and policy officer at DG ECHO, and so straight to give the floor to Francesco, please.
Thank you, Professor Bartolini, particularly for having invited us from the European Commission to provide our views and our experience with the Union Civil Protection Mechanism. Just for the sake of a brief introduction, the Civil Protection Cooperation at EU level started in 1985 with a ministerial meeting in Rome, and then evolved into a comprehensive framework in 2001, with the establishment of the Union Civil Protection Mechanism. The mechanism aims to strengthen cooperation between EU member states and 6 participating states to improve prevention, preparedness, and response to disasters. Since then, so since 2001, the legal framework has been amended 5 times. We have the Basic Act, which is dating back from 2013, which incorporates many aspects from disaster response law, international disaster response law. And then, also thanks to the new legal basis of the Lisbon Treaty, after the Portuguese forest fires in 2017, we had the creation of the Rescue Reserve just over 2 years ago. Since then, we've had several implementing acts adopted to establish relevant rescue capacities in the area of aerial forest firefightings, but also medical capacities and CBRN capacities. But also other implementing acts are being discussed while we speak in order to provide rescue and the UCPM with more tools to address the emerging challenges. So the budget, meanwhile, has been increased by 10 times. So as you can see, the mechanism is a rapidly evolving area that also, from a legal perspective, poses some great opportunities and challenges as well. So an opportunity for improving the EU's overall resilience, but also a challenge because implementing this framework can be difficult from time to time, also given the interaction between different legislative layers. As you will know, we have the European level with European co-legislators, so Parliament and Council, but then we have the national level, actually 27 national layers, plus 6 participating states, the international level. So from a legal perspective, it's quite complicated to do. But I have to say that what's even more complicated is the reality you face on the ground, because the reality is really multifaceted, and it shows a bit the limits of the rules which you set a priori. One case in point is the COVID emergency. You know, the implementing rules we had, they had to be tweaked in some cases, and new ones had to be approved during the emergency, because during the first phase of the COVID outbreak, we were really harmless against the virus at all different levels. Irrespectively of all the rules we have adopted, we still face several gaps, we have to be honest, in relation particularly to people and things originating from non-EU member states. We do have some legislation into force that covers the relevant issues. I'm talking here about customs, VAT rules, entry visas, but most legislation either does not provide for expedited procedure in the event of a disaster, or does not mention these type of emergencies at all. And this is true particularly for EU member states, but it's even more problematic from countries which are outside the EU. Just to take an example, EU legislation provides for the recognition of professional qualification for several professions, doctors, nurses, engineers, architects, for instance, as long as they've obtained, of course, their qualification either in EU member states or in some specific non-EU member states. Now, when existent for non-EU member states, the procedures that are applicable are very time-consuming, and there is no exception for emergency situation. So either we go for some ad hoc solutions, so temporary derogations, for instance, which allow for the job to be carried on during the emergency, but in general, we do not have any tool at legislative level to solve the issue for the future, so in the medium term and long-term run. So is it time to address this issue in a more consistent way? That's one open question I would launch to the other participants as well. Then we have a number of challenges. So as you know, the amount of incoming assistance or number of relief items runs a risk of overwhelming the local authorities facing an emergency while handling all this assistance. Just to take the example of the recent floods in Belgium a few months ago, training came clearly out as a need to strengthen the internal procedure to support incoming teams at European level, and not only. As you know, the participating states to the mechanism, so the 27 EU member states and the 6 participating states, which are non-EU countries, are required to have host nation support system in place, which is basically the capacity to receive assistance requested from the European Union. So to remove any foreseeable obstacle to international assistance and ensure that the response operation proceeds smoothly. Now, at European level, we have the guidelines from 2012 to assist the affected countries to receive international assistance in the most effective and efficient manner. The guidelines identify a number of legal, institutional, and operational as well actions in the areas of emergency planning, emergency management, and coordination on site, but also for logistics and transport, and also ancillary legal and financial aspects. However, each participating state needs to produce their own host nation support guidelines based on the European framework. As you can imagine, this results in a very fragmented picture, so the rules that are applicable on a case-by-case vary enormously. Coming now to the operational challenges we face on a day-to-day business. Inside the EU, the host nation support guidelines are fairly well implemented, I would say, and member states are making good use of it. Recently, last year, of course, we had many COVID-related operations, particularly in relation to the rescue stockpile delivery, where we received some adequate host nation support. We had some medical teams deployed to Italy and Slovakia, and the stockpile was sent to Italy, Spain, Republic of Serbia, Montenegro, and North Macedonia. And their host nation support was pretty good. However, for medical teams, we had some issues on how to plug them into the existing hospitals. That's not really host nation support in a way, it's more operational coordination and preparedness. But still, it's a problem I wanted to highlight as well. Coming now to the recent forest fire season, so 2021, there was some very good example of host nation support, both from transiting countries and receiving countries. We had some massive deployments to Greece and North Macedonia. We had something like 300 vehicles, I think there were 290 if I'm not mistaken, and more than 1,300 first responders, which were supported very well by local authorities. However, one coin has two sides, and the other side of the coin is that outside the EU, the situation is a bit different, because receiving countries, they do have different situation when it comes to host nation support. Just to mention two examples, the explosions in Beirut in 2020, or the situation in Haiti a few months ago. The good example where the receiving countries were so impacted by the situation that the host nation support was in a way limited. And the deployed modules and teams, they had to rely a lot on self-sufficiency. If you add to the equation the fact that COVID exacerbated the situation, particularly for Beirut and for St. Vincent, where the European teams were deployed but faced some difficulties, you know, all the situation related to PCR tests, quarantine requirements, they all resulted in a problematic situation when it comes to host nation support. Of course, not because of the fault of local authorities, but because of the problematic and multifaceted situation on the ground. One last note to mention from my side, we have seen in the recent years some significant improvement when it comes to the neighboring countries, because they have benefited from training from the European Commission and also funding from the European Commission. I'm talking about PPRD and EPA countries. And to mention an example, a positive example, the earthquake in Albania, that was a good example of host nation support. However, even in the Southern Mediterranean region, the uptake of the host nation support guidelines is still not perfect and far from being complete. And in our bilateral meeting with the local authorities and in the context of the regional cooperation programs, we are still passing on the message that we need to continue working on the issue with local authorities. Insofar as the first question is concerned, I think that's it from a European Union perspective. Thank you.
Oh, thanks a lot for this presentation. Of course, several of the points you were mentioning, particularly right now in your presentation, deal with the role of domestic authorities in this regard. So how can we, let me say, domesticize, put these international inputs at the local level, means at national level. So I'm very glad to have with us Fabio Iannacone, who is head of the legal office of the Italian Civil Protection Department, who can bring us the expertise of the Italian Civil Protection Department in this area, and also how do they perceive the role of law in their own activities. Please, Fabio.
Okay, thank you, Professor Bartolini. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. I'd like to split my intervention in two. So I will first give a general picture of what is foreseen in our national legislation concerning with the emergencies and disaster at international level. And then I'll also try to point out some critical aspects and how we can try to face and address them also with some intervention at legal level. First of all, I think one thing I'd like to point out that is a message that we, I mean, as Civil Protection Department, we often try to pass to our national legislators, but it's not an easy task in that the best way to face and address risk and emergency disaster, I mean, the best way to plan them is in quiet times, in peace times. So our idea and general approach, and we should try to insert in our national legislation across all sectors already the idea of what to do when an emergency occurs. So the system that is mainly used, that you have national legislation, or I don't know, the code of environment or whatever, that does not consider at all emergencies and only address the reality in normal times. And then when you have an emergency, you have the emergency state, the Civil Protection Department decreased, that try to kind of find the exceptional rules that try to, I mean, to act in short time in the emergency period to face cases that are out of the ordinary life of the system. So what we tried to do, for example, in the tender procedures code at national level, was already to insert an article that is how you do a tender during emergency. And this is an example, but I think this should be improved much more across different sectors. So trying to already insert what to do in emergency situation already in national sectoral legislation. moving to what we moving more to the international context and what we did in the Civil Protection Code that dates back to 2018, because I think the legislation in the sector was really fragmented. So I think we had a different set of rules around the years, and then in 2018 was I think all existing legislation with some novelties was compiled in one Civil Protection Code that tries to address the different situation from prevention, preparedness, emergency, and post-emergency phase. And in this code, we have an article 21.9, that is specifically devoted to emergencies at international level. Mainly, how do you act when there is an international emergency? There are different ways. You can act bilaterally, you can act at EU level, you can act at United Nations level. I have to say, as the previous speaker pointed out, that in spite of the fact that with the Treaty of Lisbon, the civil protection and humanitarian aid is a competence where the main role is formally played at national level and there is support at EU level, in reality, I see that the European dimension through the EU mechanism is increasing more and more in recent years. And so I have to say that looking at concrete experience, it is very rare now that you intervene outside of the EU mechanism and context. And you can see also, I mean, some of the recent emergencies have been mentioned. I'm thinking about the floods in Belgium, the fire season that was very difficult this year, and Haiti, and I think mainly most, if not all, intervention passed through the European mechanism. And this is already reflected, I have to say, in Article 29 that I just mentioned, because in this article, we already provide a general legal authorization to act under the pool and rescue. So this, I mean, national authorities can already act, do not need any further specific authorization. Then this can happen if you need to put more resources on that, but you have a legal basis already to act within the pool and rescue. Then in this article, we also have the general rules on that reminds to what we do at national level. So it reminds to Article 23 and 24 with the mobilization state and the emergency state. That are the two procedures that we have in the system when we face an emergency. Mobilization state is when an event is going to occur. So it can also be used to prevent something, or when an event is starting and you do not know already how is it going to evolve. So I think mobilization state is kind of a transitionary phase that can then move into an emergency state, as most of the case happens. And then the emergency state is the one that probably is more known also in the public debate, that after a big event, of course, you have a declaration at political level from the Council of Ministers, and so with these two declarations, you put the resources. That this is another exception. Are the national resources used for emergencies, because there is a fund in national legislation that is specifically devoted to emergencies. And then when we move at international level, you can also use international cooperation funds in support to those funds. Then this declaration, the mobilization on the emergency state, gives you the legal authority then to use the civil protection decrees when you kind of produce the rule on how to act during this emergency phase, what the operators can do, what are the costs that are reimbursed, what are the procedure. Another exception that there is at international level that I would like to mention is the fact that, contrary to an emergency state that is declared internally at national level, for an international state of emergency, you need, before the request from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And I think this gives another dimension and aspect to consider, that clearly also the area where to intervene, which countries you are going to act, clearly has also a political impact also on what is the foreign policy of the country. And then last point of the article that I just mentioned is also the possibility at comma 3 to act also without the declaration of the state of the emergency, in the sense that in the meanwhile that the Council of Ministers convene to politically endorse the intervention on the country, there is the possibility that the head of the Department of Civil Protections, by informing the President of the Council of Ministers, can already immediately mobilitate the resources, the human and technical resources. And so if authorized to do that by the President of the Council of Ministers, and by informing also the Parliament clearly, can act immediately. So even before that the declaration occurs, that's quite a strong and peculiar power that you have, and it relates to really the need to act immediately. Moving to the critical aspects, I think these have been mentioned all by the previous speakers, and really relate to what are the different procedures, and then what are the responsibility or the operators, and this need comes even stronger with specialist professions, as medical professional and doctors is the case that has been quoted more, and also with custom procedures, with the authorizations that you have. I think into pharmaceutical, just to give an example, maybe you provide some drugs to a country that are perfectly legal in your system, but are totally banned in the country that you are going to help. There are several examples like this that probably you cannot really plan, where you are under pressure, you are making an effort to act when there is a big emergency. So it's something we should consider, how to introduce and harmonize with different tools. So all this kind of legal aspect that relate to the different procedures and national system in international legislation. But on this, maybe I will focus later on how to stick into time limits.
Yeah, no, that's totally fine, your presentation, particularly because I think it has already opened the discussion for the second point. So basically, we have seen that also a way in which also the domestic Italian legal system reacted was also to have a sort of lesson learned approach, to take into account what have been the main shortcomings or difficulties in some areas, and then provide with a reform, which was quite easy because it was a domestic reform. But now for the second round of question, the basic, the common theme will be, so what will be next? So what would, in the experience of you as practitioner, could suggest also for us as academics to work on? What are the best ways, in your opinion, also from a lawmaking approach, to think about potential reforms in this area, through binding instruments, to soft law documents, to work more on the domestic level? So what would be next? In this case, I will kindly request you to stick to 5 minutes maximum, because we are a bit late. I would suggest we can start with Pontiroli Gobbi, because Francesca has also a further meeting later on. I'm also glad at the end we can also involve in the discussion also FAO, because I see now Silvi Candotti in the panel, so she can also join us among the speaker. So I would say Francesco, then we can follow the same order. So it will be Isabel, John, and then it will be Fabio, and then Ms. Candiotti for FAO. Okay, that's the order.
Thank you very much, Professor Bartolini, particularly for the flexibility when it comes to the speaking order. Apologies, but I have another meeting at 4, which is the reason why I'm not in room today, unfortunately. Anyway, when it comes to the possible improvements, well, our legal base already provides some specific provision for host nation support. We already provide the non-binding technical guidelines, so the EU host nation support guidelines. We provide templates for requests and for offers, the modules we use. So templates for the response capacities, for experts, for in-kind assistance under the Union Civil Protection Mechanism. And we know also that from recent experience, host nation support procedures in national response system, they do represent a valid tool to facilitate the mobilization and management of international assistance, both inside and outside the European Union. However, we normally conduct every year case studies following the activation and the exercises we do, and therefore we have identified a number of lessons learned. And in this context, we have identified the following lessons learned and good practices. So good practices at national level should be exchanged within the country, but also with other countries, particularly with the non-EU member states. So that's the first thing. One country may be more advanced than the other, but if we all share our lesson learned, then we'll be more prepared together. The situation has improved significantly over the recent years, also in non-EU countries, but many countries, they do still have some problems and bottlenecks when implementing the host nation support guidelines. So we will need to favor a smooth embodiment of the international teams into national response efforts that we learned with the 2021 floods, unfortunately, and we will need more trainings and more exercises. We are promoting with our neighbors host nation support concept, but we need to do it even more, both with neighborhood and enlargement countries. And also, maybe we could think about some EU-led host nation support development process for participating states. That's one thing that I'm thinking out of the blue, but it could be an interesting idea. At all levels, we need to foster and increase the knowledge when it comes to Union Civil Protection governance and procedures. As Dr. Iannacone just said, it is increasingly common to use the UCPM for national and international operations. So we need to build knowledge and to raise awareness about the mechanism at national level, but also when it comes to EU delegations, international and also regional organizations that work in high prone risk areas. So we need to basically target them both as multipliers in terms of awareness, but also targets for training. In terms of good practice, the host nation support guidelines at the moment are non-binding, as I said. One good practice is to insert these type of guidelines in the basic national civil protection law. We know, for instance, that in Italy, if I'm not mistaken, it's Article 8, letter N of the Code for Civil Protection. And then one last thought, host nation support guidelines dates back to 2012. It might be a good idea maybe to review and update these guidelines and to see whether, in addition to the mention in our Basic Act, we can make these guidelines as a binding instrument. Anyway, apologies if I will have to leave in a few minutes. I noticed that among the audience there's my colleague Danilo Bilotta. So in case there's any question from a UCPM perspective and from a union perspective, I'm sure he will be able to provide you with the necessary clarification. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Isabel, so where should we go in terms of reforms in this area? We also know that now also at the UN level, there is this discussion about the idea to elaborate a convention, for instance, in the area of protection of persons in the event of a disaster, which also include a potential provision dealing with facilitation. So what should be next?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would like to touch on 3 points. First, the importance of laws and policy to be up to date and fit for purpose. The second, the importance of effective implementation at the domestic level, and as well the concept of comprehensive disaster risk management. In regard to a new treaty, of course, IFRC is supportive to the idea. We think it could bring momentum. So, of course, it could provide incentive for states to strengthen their legal framework in their domestic legal context. However, again, I mean, for this segment, I would like maybe to focus on implementation in domestic legal context. So in order for laws to serve the interests of the most vulnerable in time of crisis, of course, it's critical that they are regularly reviewed and updated based on international best practices, but also based on the provision of the draft articles or international treaty that have also been signed and by the country. And this is, of course, critical to make communities safer and ensure that the most vulnerable are better protected when faced with crisis. One example I would like to give in our recent research on law and public health emergency preparedness and response, it has revealed that in some cases, existing laws and policies have proven to be outdated or inadequate by more than a century. So, for example, we found that many countries' laws and policies for public health emergencies are very old, with some dating back to the late 1800s or early 1900s. So the fact that a law is old does not necessarily make it unfit for purpose. However, older laws tend to not reflect the contemporary approach to disaster and comprehensive disaster risk management, which emphasizes the importance of all disaster risk management phases from risk reduction through preparedness, response, and recovery. And moreover, older laws may not take a multi-hazard approach, instead applying only a prescribed list of disasters or disease, such as some of which are no longer persistent. So the prevalence of older legislation underscores the need for states to undertake reviews of their laws, policies, and plans relating to disasters and ensure they are fit for purpose. And when required, states should bring forward new or amending legislation as a matter of urgency. And reviews should take place on a periodic basis and additionally after the occurrence of any disaster. Reviews should encompass the key issues and recommendations identified in the guidance developed by IFRC, and as I mentioned as well in the draft articles or other international treaty applicable to states. And additionally, assess how existing laws, policies, plans, and procedures performed in any recent disaster. In regard to the second point on effective implementation, I would like to highlight that it is critical for any law to be complemented by subsidiary legislation, procedures, and plans. The colleagues in this panel have already mentioned that. And also by capacity building of disaster-related officials and stakeholders who will be called to implement the provisions in practice. One way to ensure that legal reviews are undertaken and their findings implemented is to impose legal duties on appropriate actors to conduct this task. The recent experience of disaster response or a simulation exercise designed to test the operational preparedness for a disaster can provide a valuable opportunity to identify strengths, but also weaknesses in the existing disaster risk management systems and in existing disaster risk management laws, policies, procedures, and plans. Simulation exercise can be designed specifically to test legal preparedness, and learning should lead to amendments to applicable laws, policies, procedures, and plans. Further, to serve those who are most vulnerable in time of crisis, concerted implementation efforts are best driven by national and local actors who understand the country context and can guide the adaptation of international norms to that context. And this is why National Red Cross and Red Crescent societies are uniquely placed to provide quality support to their authority in strengthening legal frameworks for disasters. On the third and final point, in regard to comprehensive disaster risk management, well, we believe there is a growing need to develop further guidance on strengthening legal framework to addressing rising climate and disaster-related risk, as well as to align climate change adaptation, disaster risk management, and sustainable development, and integrate the commitment of the Sendai Framework, Paris Agreement, and Sustainable Development Goals into domestic legal and policy frameworks. And when governments around the world emerge from the current COVID crisis, many will wish to draw on the experience of the pandemic to review and strengthen their legal frameworks for disaster risk management, including for, of course, public health emergencies. And in the view of the IFRC, it is critical they adopt a comprehensive approach to climate-smart disaster risk management, including for public health emergencies. So, of course, IFRC aims to develop more international guidance and tools for law and policy makers in this regard, and we stand ready to support their efforts for effective implementation in domestic legal context. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabelle. Now let's move to John for the perspective of a workflow program. So, John, what should be done? What will be your suggestion for any potential reform in this area?
Thank you, Professor Bartolini. I suppose the issue that I was speaking to earlier concerned legal obstacles posed by kind of agreement or donor conditionality in respect of emergency response. Really, it's a case of, you know, trying to get more flexibility from the underlying legal systems. What we understand from donors is much of the conditionality they seek to apply to WFP is rooted in national legal regimes. And therefore, in order for there to be more flexibility in terms of the conditions that can be offered to entities like WFP, there needs to be more flexibility at the legislative level. And that can be done through, you know, simple, you know, humanitarian carve-outs, exceptions, greater, you know, tolerance for, you know, maybe deviations from their sanctions regimes when it comes to things like sanctions vetting or sanctions checks. Of course, it's a lot more easier said than done. I appreciate that, and there are many competing considerations at the national level that need to be taken into account. But in terms of a solution, that would be, you know, the obvious one. You know, certainly member states and donors have spoken in the past about a desire to reduce conditionality. You know, there was the grand bargain in Istanbul in 2016 where that was one of the kind of commitments, but that's quite a soft, I suppose, a soft law commitment. It's not yet being reflected in practice. You know, it's also maybe worth noting too that obviously, you know, some of these restrictions come from within the UN itself and the UN Security Council. And there, you know, obviously the United Nations Security Council sanctions regime, which all UN entities are expected to adhere to, there is a need to comply with that. Again, where there can be, in some instances, like in Afghanistan, where a lot of listed persons are now part of the government, or the de facto government, it poses operational difficulties, you know, in terms of certainly providing assistance to those government entities or entities which were considered the government until the Taliban assumed control. So, you know, again, greater flexibility there in terms of humanitarian exceptions, etc., would be very desirable. Indeed, they are needed, I would say. And finally, I think, you know, also when it comes to this kind of issue, this conditionality, there is strength in numbers, and, you know, all it takes is one UN entity to kind of set a precedent that then potentially binds all others. So, you know, in terms of kind of working with donors and coming up with alternative solutions, there is a kind of strength oftentimes in a collective response. You know, so they would be the kind of the primary observations in terms of how best to respond to the issue.
Thanks. No, these are all very interesting suggestions from all of your sides. So let's move a bit on the domestic perspective from Fabio. So what should be done?
Yeah, not an easy question, I have to say. But yeah, well, what I was mentioning before, I think the main problems that we faced at operational level were mainly based on the issue of responsibilities and different procedures. In the sense, responsibilities on, I said, for specialist professions, under which authority you are operating in a country, and what happens is your, I don't know, a medical intervention generates a bad effect, because for all international for emissions, we clearly provide insurance, but this provides a guarantee for civil aspects. But what if you move into penal aspects, or and then on the issue of procedure, I think the first thing you do when there is an earthquake, you use dog units. But I mean, if you bring dogs in a country, the first thing you face is that you have veterinary controls and quarantine for animals. These are just all kind of problems that you can face. Or another issue in our civil protection, we often use a mixture of different forces on the field. So you have people coming from the administration, volunteers, but also people coming from the army that do not act at all as if you are in the army, in the sense that they do what volunteers do. But then in a country, are you allowed to act in emergency with people coming from the armed forces, or this face a security issues? All these examples, just to say that there is an issue of harmonization. So what to do next? I mean, one maybe too ambitious idea would be to trying to say harmonize, or at least set the common ground of procedures at the international level with a big international treaty. But I know that that's really challenging. It's easier to say than to do it, and clearly maybe it's easier to reach that at European, that global level. And an example had just been mentioned with the host nation support guidelines that clearly can provide a boost to this process. Maybe a more realistic option would be to act with kind of more soft law tools and instruments. For example, I think there is an urgent need when you are going to act, especially in a not very structured situation, to have kind of country profiles. Every country does it some way, somehow, but usually you do it last time, or it's not really updated, and you are acting under the pressure of the emergency. So it could be a very good idea to set a common ground of what are the rules and procedure in several countries for, I don't know, specialist professions, custom duties, so on, and that it may be kind of centrally coordinated by an international organization, so that each country can consult them and have a commonly established ground that can be used when you really need it. And then, last but not least, there is some room for also national reform, so that you put into your national legislation a mutual recognition of the legal authorization when somebody is coming inside your country to provide support, or I think, and that's really the last example because we are time constraints. Yeah, I think to the case of accounting procedure, it happened in the past that maybe you act in very difficult situation. You really need the facility, whatever, and you pay cash maybe to a guy that is not the person that you would address in ordinary situation, but maybe it's the only solution you have to face this problem under emergency. So maybe then at the end, when you move to national realization, when you have to do accounting, maybe the procedures that you used during the emergency really not phase at all what is the, you know, what are your domestic rules for the existing situation in a country where, I don't know, there's a civil war, there are no rules, no government, and you have to find the solution anyhow. So I think also probably put a ban, put something inside the national legislation also to fund a kind of protection clause for responsibility when you are acting in extreme situation could also help. But these are just some general ideas to work.
Definitely food for thoughts. Finally, as mentioned, we have also been joined by Sylvie Wabes Candotti. She works as a resilience advisor in the Emergency and Resilience Office in FAO here in Rome. So she might also provide the views of this significant international organization, particularly for slow onset disasters such as droughts, for instance. And so that's the reason why also FAO has an interest dealing with disaster. So Sylvie, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to join you all today. And this is especially important because of the various crises that are unfolding, in front of our eyes. It's touching everyone, everywhere. So dealing with disasters, and especially preventing disasters, anticipating risk, absorbing risk, but also adapting to risks and crises, and transforming the systems we all depend on, is extremely urgent. I'm not a lawyer, I'm an agronomist, and I'm just pleased to have a few minutes with you to just bring in some of the work and some of the contribution that we do as FAO. We're also working very closely with some of you. IFRC and WP are close partners, and ECHO also. And I just want to bring in several aspects that are first, the importance of disaster and risks and disaster legislation in terms of linking to what we call in general policies, linked to the entire food system, agri-food system. This is important because here I'd like to flag a few things listening to all of you, is that yes, responding to emergency, preparing to emergency, protecting the most vulnerable is fundamental. It's part of the resilience building. But the big investments also in legislation is for the prevention of these disasters, for the impact to be reduced as much as possible, whether it's at the ecosystem management level, whether it's at infrastructure, proofing infrastructure level, whether it's in terms of services to the citizens with the early warning system. What I just wanted to bring is we're trying to make an effort, and this is where we're struggling in disaster resilience across sectors, across systems, that there's no common narrative in terms of risk management. The best framing is the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, of course, and it's including the biological hazard like the COVID what we had. But we can see we're not prepared for this. This pandemic and this disease, the health crisis, this is not really strong enough in the disaster and risk management arena. And the call is, and this is very much linked to the latest food system summit and learning we've been contributing, especially on resilience. The resilience is the main element for the path to sustainability. And legislation as part of the priority policies is needed at all levels. And the coherence, we don't have the coherence between the global to the local level. And many of you have mentioned these aspects, not only in time of emergency, but also for the development, for the investments that are done in times of calm ahead before any disasters is happening. And here we'd just like to present or make a plea, a call in the sense of building on the shared narrative of risk management for resilience using, and I will put the link on the UN Common Guidance on Resilience, which is a multi-actor, multi-risk, multi-sector or system approach, multi-location, multi-time scale. And it's really one big reference for all of us to work on. It's been produced by several, more than 15 UN entities, and it should serve as a reference for bringing all this in terms of language and action. And it calls for 5 main capacities: to prevention, to prevent, to anticipate, to absorb, to adapt, and to transform. And all this is needed for resilience building of the whole of society across sectors. Now, us in FAO, we're really dealing with the agri-food sectors. But we're bringing this to the agri-food sectors. Bringing this to the agri-food sectors, what we need is the policies and legislation that help us to move forward on coherence and convergence between many risk management tools. And here I'm not putting so much emphasis on emergency response, which is part of the work, of course, but on the suite of risk management tools, which I can post in the chat, where the governance is really the fundamental one, where legislation is sitting, but it's really articulated to hold needs this suite of risk management tools for moving forward. And that includes the risk monitoring. Here we're talking about all types of risks. The risk of disasters, natural and human induced disasters, including conflict. But even if we don't go to conflicts, let's keep on the whole range of shocks and stresses. That means the constant risk monitoring system, actionable alert. It needs the risk transfer mechanism, including insurance and social protection. It needs on-site measures of risk reduction and risk management at community, farm, enterprise, the whole food value chain level. We also need to risk-proof infrastructure, building codes. You know, the legislation aspects of the building codes is so important. It's well known for earthquake, but it's the same now for all the climate extreme events. Increasing winds, increasing heat waves, and so on that are affecting us. A big piece of work on what we call nature-based solution, which is really the way, and this needs to be regulated, the way we use nature. Nature as a defense, but nature for many services that it plays in terms of water, soil, shelter, and so on. And again, on the agri-food system, the whole aspects of food waste and loss is very important. And I will end with the whole consumption, which is the way that we're consuming food, the way that we are having our diets, which are nature positive, climate friendly, inclusive, fair, just, etc., etc. And that's the whole agri-food system perspective, with this risk management at the center for the transformation that we need today. This transformation is needed to tackle the global crises that are all affecting us, the climate crisis, the health crisis like COVID, the biodiversity crisis, the pollution crisis, acting at global level, and then the reality on the ground of all the other type of disasters and shocks that affect and threaten, especially most vulnerable people. I'll stop here. This is just maybe not concrete enough for some of the aspect of the conversation, but it's very important because it's flagging the need we have for a specific sector or system, and this coherence in terms of narrative of action between the global and the local action in terms of risk management. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Sylvie, for this presentation. No, I think it was very, on the contrary, very fit for the conversation, because also explain also practical way in order to translate the international inputs we might have into more specific activities and concrete action by both the international and the local actors. I think we are now at the end of this session, which I don't know if there are some specific question. Even if this was a bit more a sort of conversation rather than expecting a Q&A session in this regard. So Having said that, I think we are particularly grateful as editors and also as a team of the Yearbook of the National Disaster Law to have such a distinguished speaker representative of relevant humanitarian actors with us this afternoon, mainly because we think one of the main goals we should try to work together is to reduce the distance between academics and practitioners in order to foster common interests and common areas of research and activities for a better legal and policy framework in this regard. So I'm very grateful all of you reserved such a time in your very packed agenda in order to start a conversation with us as academics, which I'm sure could, let me say, establish further bridges between different world, different communities, which should more and more work closer in this regard. So, having said that, I thank everyone for joining for this session on dialogue with practitioners. We can close this session and have a short breaks. We could resume in 15 minutes with a further session on emerging and neglected question of international disaster law, going to expand on some topics which are really or emerging or are not well having been very well addressed by practice or by legal research. So we see you in around 15 minutes from now. So especially for those in the virtual audience, you can also have a virtual break and see you in a while. Thanks a lot for your participation. Thanks so much.
Thanks to you.
Thank you. Goodbye.